Over the top? No, we had no over the top rules. We were totally reasonable, thoughtful parents who made solid decisions at every turn.
There are people in Hollywood who seem untouchable. Directors who carry an almost mythological reputation, beloved, respected, and somehow always above the fray. Ron Howard has been one of those people for decades. The freckle-faced kid from Oklahoma who grew up on television screens across America, who made the leap from Opie Taylor to one of the most successful directors in cinema history. A man who built his entire public image around warmth, integrity, and good old-fashioned American decency. But here is the thing about carefully constructed images: they have a way of cracking under the weight of time. And after 50 years of staying quiet, of smiling through the chaos and keeping the darker chapters locked behind closed doors, Ron Howard has finally started talking. And what he is revealing is not the feel-good story most people expected. It is something far more complicated, far more painful, and in some cases, far more troubling than anyone who grew up watching him on screen could have imagined. This is not the story Hollywood wants you to hear. But it is the one Ron Howard is finally telling. To understand who Ron Howard really is, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the polished beginning that publicity teams crafted over the years, but the raw, uncertain, financially desperate beginning that his family lived through before anyone knew his name. Ron Howard was born on March 1, 1954, in Duncan, Oklahoma. His father Rance was an actor chasing a dream that barely paid the bills, and his mother Jean was right there beside him, also trying to carve out a career in a business that chews people up and spits them out without hesitation. When Ron was 4 years old, the entire family packed everything they owned and moved to Hollywood. No guarantees. No connections. No safety net. Just a belief that if they stayed close enough to the dream, it might eventually let them in. They settled into a tiny home in Burbank, living close enough to major studios that young Ron grew up watching camera crews, directors, and actors as part of his everyday landscape. He did not attend a conventional preschool. His education happened on film sets, absorbing a world that most children only see in movies. And while that sounds almost magical in the retelling, the lived reality was something else entirely. The family struggled financially in ways that left real marks. There were moments when Rance Howard seriously considered giving up, packing everything back into boxes, and returning to Oklahoma to work as a farmer. The dream nearly died multiple times before it ever had a chance to breathe. Ron's first screen appearance came when he was just 18 months old, not because anyone had grand ambitions for him, but because his father needed a baby for one brief scene in a film called Frontier Woman, and Ron happened to be available. That accidental beginning set in motion something neither of his parents had fully planned for. And yet, despite the opportunities that started presenting themselves, his parents made a firm and controversial decision: no full-time acting contracts until Ron turned 5. They held that line even as the bills piled up, even as they pawned belongings to keep the lights on, even as the financial pressure became almost unbearable. It was a decision rooted in love, but it nearly destroyed them. By the time Ron landed the role of Opie Taylor on The Andy Griffith Show in 1960 at 6 years old, the family had already been through more hardship than most people realize. More than 300 children auditioned for that role. Ron got it through a combination of natural charm and years of unconsciously absorbing how performance works. The show began airing on October 3, 1960, and became one of the most beloved television programs in American history. Ron appeared in 243 of its 249 episodes. He started at $300 per episode and eventually earned $1,000 per episode by the time the show wrapped in 1968. But here is what the warm, nostalgic glow of those episodes hides. Ron Howard was a child carrying an adult's professional responsibilities. There was no live studio audience offering feedback in real time. Every scene, every comedic beat, every emotional moment had to be executed with precise, rehearsed timing. He was 6 years old doing work that most trained adult actors find demanding. And the person who helped him navigate all of that was Andy Griffith himself, who took on something of a mentor role, explaining scenes between takes, sitting with Ron, treating him with a patience and respect that the boy genuinely needed. What Ron kept quiet about for a long time, though, was the harder side of that relationship. Andy Griffith was a complicated man who struggled with drinking. There were angry moments on set. There were times when Griffith read a bad review aloud and lost his composure in front of the entire crew. Ron witnessed all of it as a small child, processing emotions and situations that no child should have to process in a professional environment. And then, in 1962, when Ron was 8 years old, something happened that could have ended everything. During a fishing scene filmed on a small lake, the boat tipped and Ron fell into the water. Andy Griffith saw it happen and jumped in immediately, pulling the boy to safety. It was a genuine act of heroism, and it was buried immediately by producers who feared the story would damage the show's reputation. No safety investigation. No policy review. Just silence. That near drowning stayed with Ron Howard for the rest of his life. And it quietly shaped the director he would eventually become. When The Andy Griffith Show ended in 1968, Ron Howard was 14 years old and suddenly invisible. The industry that had welcomed him as a charming child had no clear place for a teenage boy who everyone still associated with Opie. He went to more than 50 auditions in 1968 and 1969 and came home empty-handed from every single one. The rejection was relentless. He took whatever small roles came available, a guest appearance here, a supporting part there, all of them paying far less than what he had been earning as a child. The anxiety that built up during that period was something he hid carefully from those around him, channeling the pressure into school activities and an athletic life that gave him somewhere to put all that restless energy. Then came 1973 and a film called American Graffiti, directed by a then-emerging filmmaker named George Lucas. Ron Howard was 19 and cast alongside actors who would become Hollywood legends. On the surface, it was a breakthrough. Behind the scenes, it was one of the most humiliating experiences of his career. Harrison Ford and Paul Le Mat targeted him. They threw beer bottles near his car. They yelled at him to perform like his childhood character, mocking him for the very thing that had defined his entire life. They locked him in a trailer, deliberately making him miss rehearsals. They spiked his drinks. It was sustained, calculated bullying, and the reason, according to Howard himself, was simple. They did not respect child stars, and they wanted him to know it. Ron stayed silent through all of it. He kept showing up, kept working, kept swallowing the humiliation. He earned $10,000 for that film while watching it go on to make $115 million domestically on a budget of less than $800,000. When he asked George Lucas for even 1% of the profits, a request that would have been worth over $1 million, Lucas refused without hesitation. The refusal damaged a friendship that had seemed genuinely promising. Harrison Ford apologized years later. But the wound from that period, the sense of being dismissed, undervalued, and mocked, never fully healed. His time on Happy Days, which began in January 1974, brought stability back to his career and introduced him to 31 million weekly viewers at the show's peak. But even there, nothing was as smooth as the television image suggested. By 1976, the network wanted to rename the show entirely to capitalize on Henry Winkler's exploding popularity as the Fonz. Ron Howard, who had been the center of the show from the very beginning, was being quietly pushed aside by the machine he had helped build. He issued an ultimatum: change the name, and he walks. The producers initially pushed back. Then 10,000 letters flooded ABC from outraged fans, and the network backed down. But the salary gap told a clearer story about where Howard actually stood. While the show was generating $50 million per year, Ron was earning $25,000 per episode. Winkler was earning $75,000. The disparity was not just financial. It was a statement about how the industry valued them. And for Ron Howard, who had been working professionally since he was 18 months old, who had given the industry decades of his childhood and adolescence, that statement stung deeply. The cast tensions during that era were also far more volatile than anyone publicly admitted. Arguments over money and screen time led to at least one major on-set blow-up during filming in late 1976. The show's creator Gary Marshall worked hard to keep a lid on everything because the financial stakes were simply too high to allow the chaos to become public. But years later, when former cast members filed a $10 million lawsuit over unpaid royalties for merchandise alone, Happy Days lunchboxes, toys, branded products that had generated extraordinary revenue, the settlement each person received was just $65,000. The gap between what the show made and what the people who made it received was staggering. Ron Howard was not part of that lawsuit. He had already moved on. But in a 2025 interview, he acknowledged that those years had come close to fracturing friendships that had felt permanent. When Ron Howard left Happy Days in July 1980, turning down a $100,000 offer from ABC in favor of a $1 million deal with NBC that gave him creative control, He was betting everything on a version of himself that had not yet been proven at scale. The transition to directing had begun quietly in 1975 with a 10-minute short film shot during a 2-week break on a $2,000 budget. It had continued with Grand Theft Auto in 1977, a low-budget feature that made $15 million. But the real test was still ahead. What followed over the next 4 decades was a body of work that would generate billions of dollars, produce Academy Award winners, and establish Ron Howard as one of the most commercially successful directors in Hollywood history. What the public did not see was the extraordinary chaos that surrounded virtually every major production. During Grand Theft Auto in 1977, a stunt went catastrophically wrong and a performer was seriously injured. Howard settled the resulting lawsuit quietly and made safety protocols a non-negotiable foundation of every future project. During Cocoon in 1985, he received death threats from a fired crew member who believed the film mocked elderly people. The production had to hire round-the-clock security and soften the script to reduce tensions. During Backdraft in 1991, fire stunts burned Kurt Russell and 3 crew members, triggering an OSHA investigation that found serious safety violations. Howard later admitted that no one on that set truly understood when the fire would turn on them. The production of A Beautiful Mind in 2001, which ultimately won Best Picture and Best Director at the Academy Awards, was internally described as barely controlled chaos. Russell Crowe's behavior on and off set was erratic and sometimes violent. Howard actually fired him at one point, then brought him back 2 days later when the financial mathematics of the situation made it clear that holding the line would cost $500,000 per day. The film that emerged was celebrated as a triumph. What it took to get there was something else entirely. Then there was The Da Vinci Code in 2006, a production that generated a level of global controversy that went far beyond anything Howard had navigated before. Religious groups across multiple countries demanded bans. Howard received death threats and required bodyguards after a bomb scare at the Cannes premiere. The Catholic Church launched organized campaigns against the film. In Italy, Howard and author Dan Brown came close to facing legal consequences for filming without proper permits. Critics were openly hostile during the first screening. And through all of it, Howard kept defending his artistic choices while privately describing the sustained anger as something that wore on him in ways he had not anticipated. The film made $760 million worldwide. The personal cost was harder to calculate. Ron Howard has always presented his family life as his anchor, the stable, loving foundation that gave him the strength to survive everything Hollywood threw at him. And there is genuine truth in that picture. He met Cheryl Alley in high school.